In September 52 BCE, Vercingetorix, the charismatic young king of the Arverni tribe, stared down from the hilltop fortress of Alesia at the most audacious engineering project he had ever witnessed. Below him, tens of thousands of Roman soldiers were constructing dual rings of fortifications that would stretch for nearly 40 kilometers, complete with watchtowers, trenches, and deadly traps. What the Gallic commander didn't yet realize was that he was watching Julius Caesar build the cage that would trap 80,000 warriors and crush the last great hope of Gallic independence. Within days, this fortress would become a killing ground where Roman discipline would prove devastatingly superior to Celtic courage, and where the laughter of barbarian warriors would turn to screams. The story of Alesia doesn't begin with the siege itself, but with a fundamental clash of military philosophies that had been brewing for centuries. To understand why Alesia became such a decisive slaughter, you need to understand how profoundly different Roman and Celtic approaches to warfare actually were. Celtic warriors viewed combat as a deeply personal affair, an arena where individual glory mattered more than collective victory. When Celtic armies gathered for battle, they weren't just assembling military units. They were staging a performance. Ancient sources describe the terrifying spectacle Celtic forces created as they prepared to fight. Warriors would blast horns and trumpets, creating what the Greek historian Polybius described as a tumult of sounds so intense that it seemed the very countryside had caught up the cry. Some warriors fought completely naked, their bodies painted in elaborate designs, turning their own flesh into psychological weapons meant to unnerve opponents before a single blow was struck. This wasn't reckless stupidity. The Celts understood something profound about human psychology in combat. They knew that battles were often decided in the first moments of contact, when courage either held firm or shattered. By creating an overwhelming sensory assault, deafening noise, shocking nudity, fierce battle cries, and the sight of enormous warriors wielding massive swords, they sought to break enemy morale before swords even clashed. For centuries, this approach had worked spectacularly well against opponents who fought as individual warriors rather than as disciplined units. Celtic society elevated the warrior to a sacred status. Young boys who aspired to join this elite class underwent years of rigorous training, learning not just the mechanics of combat, but the elaborate code of honor that governed it. A Celtic warrior's reputation was his most valuable possession, and he would risk death to preserve or enhance it. Before major battles, individual champions would step forward from the battle lines and issue challenges to single combat, shouting out their own glorious deeds and those of their ancestors while mocking their opponents. These ritual combats could last for hours as entire armies watched, and the outcome often affected the morale of both sides more than the actual military situation. The weapons Celtic warriors carried reflected their emphasis on individual prowess. Their primary weapon was the sword, typically a long slashing blade that could measure well over half a meter. Early Celtic swords from the Hallstatt period were massive, designed for powerful overhead strikes that could cleave through shields and armor. By the Latin period, when Vercingetorix was leading his coalition, Celtic smiths had perfected iron longswords that were both deadly and beautifully decorated, often personalized with elaborate designs stamped into the blade or applied to ornate scabbards. But the sword was a weapon of status, expensive to produce and maintain. Poorer warriors fought with spears. The Celtic vocabulary had 4 different terms for various types of spears, reflecting their ubiquity. The geisum was a heavy javelin, while longer spears served as thrusting weapons. A typical Celtic warrior might carry anywhere from 1 to 4 spears into battle, using them to soften up enemy formations before closing to sword range. The most elite Celtic warriors fought on horseback or from chariots. Celtic culture held horses in such high regard that ownership of these animals was directly linked to social status and wealth. The Greek geographer Strabo wrote that although all Gauls were naturally great warriors, they fought better on horseback than on foot, and that the finest Roman cavalry was recruited from their ranks. This wasn't mere flattery. Romans regularly employed Gallic horsemen as auxiliary cavalry, valuing their skill and aggression. Celtic chariots were masterpieces of engineering, Light, two-wheeled vehicles pulled by two horses and made almost entirely from organic materials except for metal reinforcement on the wheel hubs and rims. The typical Celtic chariot measured about 4 meters long and 2 meters wide. In battle, two warriors occupied each chariot. One drove, while the other threw javelins from the moving platform. When the moment was right, the warrior would leap down to fight on foot, while the driver waited nearby, ready to evacuate him if wounded, or to allow a rapid repositioning. Celtic cavalry employed similarly sophisticated tactics. Ancient sources describe a practice called trimarcesia, where each mounted warrior was accompanied by two attendants, each with their own horse. If the warrior's horse was killed, one attendant would immediately mount it in his place while continuing the fight. If the warrior himself was wounded, one attendant would escort him back to camp while the other took his position in the line. This required extensive coordination and training, giving lie to the image of Celtic warriors as entirely undisciplined savages. Yet for all their individual skill and tactical innovation in cavalry warfare, Celtic armies struggled with the kind of coordinated infantry tactics that won prolonged engagements. Celtic military organization was based on tribal affiliation rather than tactical specialization. Warriors from the same clan fought together regardless of what weapons they carried. While this created strong bonds of loyalty and mutual protection, it made large-scale tactical maneuvers almost impossible. When a Celtic army charged into battle, it was essentially a mass of individual warriors and small warrior bands, each seeking personal glory, rather than a coordinated fighting machine. Some Celtic forces did demonstrate higher levels of organization. Elite warrior bands like the Irish Fianna or the Geisate who fought against Rome operated as disciplined units, often serving as shock troops who would hurl themselves into enemy formations at the start of an engagement. These groups, typically composed of young men led by charismatic leaders, seem to have functioned almost like military societies with their own initiation rituals and codes of conduct. But they were the exception rather than the rule, representing perhaps a few hundred elite warriors in armies that numbered in the tens of thousands. Caesar himself, writing in his commentaries on the Gallic Wars, contradicts some of the more extreme characterizations of Celtic disorganization. He describes the Helvetii forming a phalanx-like formation to defend against cavalry and advancing in close order. He mentions the Arverni using arrows against his troops, and notes that some Gallic armies could form testudo-like formations similar to those used by Romans. But these instances of tactical sophistication seem to have been situational adaptations rather than standard practice, and they appeared most commonly among the wealthier, more organized tribes. The Celtic approach to warfare was fundamentally offensive and aggressive. They excelled at the initial shock of combat when their psychological warfare, superior individual skill, and fierce charges could overwhelm less disciplined opponents. Ancient accounts consistently describe the terror inspired by the sight and sound of a Celtic army preparing to attack. But this offensive power came with critical weaknesses that became apparent in prolonged engagements or when facing opponents who refused to break. The Roman military machine that Julius Caesar commanded in Gaul represented the complete opposite of the Celtic warrior tradition. Where Celts emphasized individual glory, Romans demanded total subordination to unit cohesion. Where Celtic warriors sought personal combat with worthy opponents, Roman legionaries fought as interchangeable parts in a larger mechanism. Where Celts relied on the shock of initial contact, Romans built entire tactical systems around sustained combat and methodical destruction of enemy formations. The foundation of Roman military superiority was the legion, a highly organized unit of approximately 5,000 soldiers divided into smaller tactical formations, called cohorts and centuries. Each legionary carried standardized equipment, a large rectangular shield called a scutum, a short stabbing sword called a gladius, two throwing spears called pila, body armor, and a helmet. But the real weapon wasn't any individual piece of equipment. It was the training that allowed thousands of men to function as a single entity. Roman soldiers drilled constantly, practicing the precise movements and formations that would keep them alive in battle. They learned to maintain exact spacing between soldiers, approximately 3 feet according to the military writer Vegetius, which allowed them enough room to use their weapons effectively while staying close enough to support each other. They practiced transitioning between open and closed formations, knowing when to spread out for offensive sword work and when to lock shields in defensive formations. The most famous of these formations was the testudo, or tortoise. In this configuration, soldiers in the front ranks held their shields vertically to create a wall, while soldiers in the rear ranks held their shields horizontally above their heads, overlapping them like roof tiles. Soldiers on the flanks could orient their shields outward to protect the sides. The result was a nearly impenetrable mobile fortress that could advance even under heavy missile fire. The Greek historian Plutarch described the testudo as Mark Antony's troops used it against Parthian archers. The shield-bearers wheeled round and enclosed the light-armed troops within their ranks, dropped down to one knee, and held their shields out as a defensive barrier. The men behind them held their shields over the heads of the first rank, while the third rank did the same for the second rank. The resulting shape, which is a remarkable sight, looks very like a roof, and is the surest protection against arrows, which just glance off it. The testudo was slow and sacrificed mobility for protection, making it vulnerable in open-field combat against cavalry or when facing enemies who could force close-quarters fighting. But for specific tactical situations, particularly advancing under fire during sieges or creating protected formations to resist cavalry charges, it was devastatingly effective. The key was that Roman commanders knew when to use it and could count on their men to execute the formation perfectly, even under extreme stress. Roman tactical doctrine emphasized flexibility. Legions could quickly form different configurations depending on the enemy and terrain. Against cavalry, they would form square formations with shields facing outward and javelins bristled forward like a hedge of spears. Against infantry, they typically deployed in the traditional checkerboard pattern that allowed units to support each other while maintaining the gaps necessary for tactical maneuver. Roman offensive tactics were equally systematic. Before closing to sword range, legionaries would hurl their pillar at enemy formations. These weren't ordinary spears, they were specifically designed to defeat shields. A pilum had a long iron shank attached to a wooden shaft. When it struck a shield, the soft iron shank would bend, making the weapon impossible to throw back and weighing down the enemy's shield, forcing him to discard it. Even if the pilum missed its target, it would stick in the ground at an awkward angle, creating obstacles for advancing enemies. Only after this missile barrage would Romans close to sword range, and here their weapons and tactics gave them another crucial advantage. The gladius was a short stabbing sword, typically around 60 to 70 centimeters long. This might seem inadequate compared to the meter-long Celtic longswords, but in the crush of close combat, length became a liability. A Roman soldier could kill with a short, controlled thrust while staying behind his shield. A Celtic warrior needed room to swing his longer blade, and once Roman formations closed tight, that room disappeared. The Roman military system also included sophisticated logistics and engineering that Celtic forces couldn't match. Roman armies built fortified camps every night when on campaign, complete with defensive ditches and wooden palisades. These camps followed a standard layout so that every soldier knew exactly where his unit would be positioned, allowing armies to form up quickly if attacked. Roman forces carried extensive engineering tools and could construct bridges, siege equipment, and fortifications with remarkable speed. This engineering capability would prove decisive at Alesia, where Caesar's legions would construct siege works on a scale that seemed almost supernatural to the watching Gauls. But the fortifications at Alesia didn't materialize from nowhere. They were the product of years of experience, standardized techniques, and a military culture that valued systematic preparation as much as battlefield courage. The cultural differences between Roman and Celtic military systems went beyond tactics and equipment. For Romans, military service was a civic duty and a path to economic stability. Soldiers served for fixed terms, received regular pay, and could expect land grants upon retirement. This created professional armies with strong institutional memory and standardized training. A Roman soldier's loyalty was first to his legion, then to his commander, and ultimately to Rome itself. Celtic warriors, by contrast, often followed personal loyalties to clan leaders or charismatic war chiefs. When Vercingetorix called the tribes to unite against Rome, he was asking warriors to subordinate ancient tribal rivalries and personal ambitions to a larger strategic vision, something that ran counter to centuries of Celtic military culture. The coalition he assembled represented an unprecedented achievement in Gallic politics, but it remained fundamentally unstable. By 52 BCE, Julius Caesar had been campaigning in Gaul for 6 years. He had won brilliant victories, suffered embarrassing defeats, and was in the process of conquering a territory roughly equivalent to modern France and Belgium. But Gallic resistance was far from broken. The campaigns of 53 BCE had been particularly brutal, and Caesar's announcement that Gaul would now be treated as a full Roman province, subject to Roman laws and religion, created existential terror among the Gallic tribes. The Gauls had good reason to fear Roman conquest didn't just mean political submission, it threatened the very heart of Celtic religious and cultural life. Each year, the Druids of all Gaul met at a sacred site maintained by the Carnutes tribe, a place considered the centre of the Gallic world. Here, they mediated disputes between tribes and maintained the spiritual traditions that bound Celtic society together. The prospect of Roman authority destroying these sacred lands finally accomplished what military defeats had not. It united the fractious Gallic tribes under a single leader. Vercingetorix was a young king of the Arverni, one of the most powerful tribes in Gaul. His very name meant the great chief of the brave in the Celtic language. He had spent time in Caesar's entourage earlier in his career, learning Roman tactics and organization firsthand. His father, Celtillus, had been a wealthy and influential nobleman who had attempted to transform his elected position into kingship, only to be executed by his own people for this ambition. Despite, or perhaps because of, his father's fate, Vercingetorix succeeded in uniting the Arverni under his rule and then using that power base to forge an unprecedented coalition of Gallic tribes. At a grand council at Barbarian in the spring of 52 BCE, representatives from nearly every Gallic tribe gathered and elected Vercingetorix as supreme commander of their united forces. This was revolutionary. For the first time in their history, the Gauls were fighting not as individual tribes pursuing glory and revenge, but as a nation defending their homeland and way of life. Caesar himself, writing years later, admitted his opponent was a young man of considerable talent, second to none in his abilities as a leader and warrior. Vercingetorix demonstrated his strategic sophistication almost immediately. Rather than seeking the kind of glorious pitched battle that Celtic tradition celebrated, he adopted a scorched earth strategy that attacked Rome's fundamental weakness: supply lines. He ordered all food and forage destroyed in areas where Roman forces might operate. Towns that couldn't be adequately defended were burned, their populations relocated to fortified positions. This was a bitter strategy that required enormous political will, asking people to destroy their own homes and crops. But Vercingetorix understood that Celtic armies couldn't defeat Roman legions in sustained conventional warfare. The strategy worked brilliantly at first. Caesar's legions, accustomed to foraging off the land and requisitioning supplies from conquered territories, suddenly found themselves facing starvation. The Roman army did manage to capture the town of Avaricum after a difficult siege, giving the starving legionaries desperately needed food, but this was only a temporary reprieve. Vercingetorix's next move was even more impressive. He chose to make a stand at Gergovia, the Arvernian capital, forcing Caesar to conduct a siege in difficult terrain. Here, the Gallic commander demonstrated that he had learned from Roman tactics, using the strong defensive position to his advantage while employing arrows and coordinated defensive formations. When Caesar attempted an assault on the town, his forces were badly bloodied, losing hundreds of men. The Romans were forced to abandon the siege, a humiliating setback that showed Vercingetorix's strategy was working. But then, Vercingetorix made the kind of mistake that distinguishes good commanders from great ones. Emboldened by his success at Gergovia, he decided to transition from defensive warfare to offensive action. He attempted to ambush Caesar's legions as they regrouped, launching a massive cavalry attack. It should have worked, The Gauls had superior cavalry forces and Caesar was in a vulnerable position. But the attack was poorly coordinated, and Caesar's Germanic auxiliary cavalry, supported by his legionaries, managed to turn the Gallic charge into a rout. For the first time in the campaign, Vercingetorix had been decisively beaten in open combat. Worse, he had lost a significant portion of his cavalry, the very force that had made his scorched earth strategy viable by allowing him to control territory and raid Roman supply lines. With his mounted forces streaming away from the battlefield in disorder, Vercingetorix made a decision that would seal the fate of Gallic independence. He retreated with his remaining 80,000 infantry and 12,000 cavalry to the fortified hilltop town of Alesia. Alesia belonged to the Mandubii tribe and sat atop Mont Ossois in what is now eastern France. It was an impressive natural fortress, positioned on a lofty hill approximately 150 meters high, with rivers on two sides and steep approaches from all directions. The Gauls had reinforced nature's defences with extensive trenches and a stone wall around the settlement. It seemed like the perfect position from which to continue the campaign, defensible, provisioned, and close enough to friendly territory that a relief force could be assembled. But Vercingetorix was thinking like a Gallic warrior king, not like Julius Caesar. He saw Alesia as a strong defensive position from which he could recover and regroup. Caesar saw it as an opportunity to end the war in a single, decisive engagement. And what Caesar understood, which Vercingetorix initially did not eat, was that the Romans' greatest strength wasn't their tactical superiority in open battle, it was their unmatched ability to conduct siege warfare through superior engineering and logistics. As Caesar's 10 legions, approximately 60,000 men, arrived at the outskirts of Alesia, they didn't prepare to assault the town. Instead, they began to dig, and they kept digging for weeks, constructing siege works on a scale that seemed impossible to the defenders watching from above. The Romans' first line of fortifications, called the circumvallation, encircled Alesia itself. This inner ring stretched for approximately 16.7 kilometers and included 23 fortified positions, manned by sentries who kept watch day and night. But the circumvallation was just the beginning. In front of it, Roman engineers dug multiple defensive lines. First, a trench filled with water diverted from nearby rivers, then a second trench about 4 meters wide and nearly 2 meters deep, and finally, in the area immediately in front of the main fortification, they installed thousands of deadly traps. These traps were ingeniously designed to kill or maim attacking infantry. Some were camouflaged pits containing sharpened stakes. The Romans called them lilia, or lilies, because of their flower-like arrangement. Others were called sippi, wooden stakes with iron hooks protruding from them, designed to catch the legs and feet of charging warriors. Still others were stimuli, iron spikes hidden in shallow pits and covered with brush. An attacking force would have to navigate this nightmare of obstacles while under constant missile fire from the walls and towers behind them. Modern archaeology has confirmed Caesar's descriptions of these fortifications, though the reality seems to have been somewhat less complete than Caesar claimed. The defensive lines weren't entirely continuous. Roman engineers intelligently used natural terrain features like rivers, marshes, and steep slopes as part of their defensive system. But what they built was still extraordinary. At regular intervals along the circumvallation, the Romans constructed wooden towers that allowed defenders to see over the walls and rain down projectiles on anyone attempting to assault the fortifications. But the circumvallation was only half of Caesar's plan. What he built next defied even his own soldiers' understanding of siege warfare. Once the inner ring was complete, Caesar ordered his legions to construct a second line of fortifications, this one facing outward. The contravallation, as it was called, would encircle the entire Roman force with walls, trenches, and traps identical to those protecting against Alesia. When completed, this outer ring measured approximately 21 kilometers, creating a defensive perimeter so vast it seemed impossible that 60,000 men could adequately defend it. Archaeological evidence confirms the scale of what Caesar achieved. In just 4 to 5 weeks, Roman legionaries moved millions of cubic meters of earth. They dug trenches totaling nearly 40 kilometers in combined length, some reaching depths of 4.5 meters. They erected wooden palisades standing 4 meters high. They planted thousands upon thousands of sharpened stakes, dug countless camouflaged pits, and constructed 23 fortified redoubts positioned at strategic intervals around both rings. Modern engineers examining the site have calculated that this required each Roman soldier to move approximately 2 cubic meters of earth per day, an exhausting pace maintained day after day without modern equipment. The result was a double ring of fortifications unlike anything the ancient world had seen before. The Romans had created what military historians call a donut siege, fortifications facing both inward toward the besieged and outward toward expected relief forces. Caesar had effectively placed his entire army under siege while simultaneously maintaining a siege of his own. It was a gamble of staggering audacity. If the Gallic relief army arrived before the fortifications were complete, or if it proved large enough to overwhelm the outer defences, the Romans would be trapped between two hostile forces with nowhere to retreat. Inside Alesia, Vercingetorix watched the Roman construction with growing alarm. He had initially believed the Romans would attempt a direct assault or a conventional siege. Now he realized Caesar was attempting something far more ambitious and far more dangerous to the Gallic cause. The young king understood that time was now the critical factor. His cavalry had to break through before the outer fortifications were complete and summon a relief force large enough to shatter Roman lines before starvation forced surrender. Under cover of darkness, before the Roman circumvallation could be fully closed, Vercingetorix dispatched his remaining cavalry, all 12,000 horsemen, with desperate orders. They were to ride to every tribe in Gaul, summon every warrior who could hold a weapon, and return as quickly as possible with the largest army Gaul had ever assembled. The cavalry sortie was partially successful. Most of the horsemen managed to slip through gaps in the incomplete fortifications, suffering casualties but avoiding destruction. They scattered across Gaul, carrying Vercingetorix's call for help. With the cavalry gone, Vercingetorix faced the mathematics of siege warfare. He had approximately 80,000 warriors garrisoned in Alesia, plus the town's civilian population. Even with careful rationing, the food supply might last 30 days at most. He ordered all grain collected and placed under his direct control, implementing strict rationing that would keep his army capable of fighting while stretching supplies as far as possible. Every stomach went hungry, but in those first weeks it was manageable. Then came a decision that would haunt everyone who witnessed it. As food supplies dwindled and no relief force appeared, the Gauls inside Alesia made a desperate choice. The town's women, children, elderly, and sick, those who could not fight but consumed precious rations, were expelled from the city. Thousands of civilians, including the families of the warriors manning the walls, were sent out through the gates with nothing but the clothes on their backs. These refugees approached the Roman lines expecting to be taken as slaves or prisoners. Slavery would be harsh, but it would mean food and survival. Instead, they encountered something more terrible than they had imagined. Caesar, whose own food supplies were stretched thin by the demands of his enormous army, refused to allow them through his fortifications. The refugees were trapped in the killing ground between Alesia's walls and Roman defences, caught in a no-man's land where neither side would help them. For days, then weeks, these civilians remained in this hellish limbo. They had no shelter, no food, no water, except what they could gather from rain. The warriors on Alesia's walls could see their own families starving slowly in the wasteland below. Mothers, children, grandparents dying within sight, but beyond reach. Roman soldiers manning the fortifications watched the suffering with grim faces but held their positions. Neither side could afford mercy. Some ancient sources claim these trapped civilians called out to both forces, begging for food, for water, for death. Their cries echoed across the valley at night. Many did die there, between the walls, their bodies left where they fell as a grim reminder of the stakes of this conflict. It was a tragedy that demonstrated the brutal calculus of siege warfare. Vercingetorix couldn't feed non-combatants without weakening his army, and Caesar couldn't feed them without easing the pressure on the defenders. In the end, both commanders chose their military objectives over mercy. While this human tragedy unfolded, messengers from Vercingetorix's cavalry were racing across Gaul, rallying the tribes. The response was unprecedented. From every corner of Gaul, warriors gathered. According to Caesar's own account, the relief force eventually numbered approximately 250 paid men, though some ancient sources claimed as many as 400,000. Modern historians are skeptical of these enormous figures, suggesting the actual number may have been significantly lower, perhaps 100,000 to 150,000. But even the conservative estimates meant a relief force at least twice the size of Caesar's entire army. The Gallic relief force was commanded by 4 chiefs representing different tribal coalitions. Among them was Vercingetorix, Vercingetorix's own cousin, leading an army of Arverni warriors who had every personal and tribal reason to fight desperately for their king's survival. The political achievement represented by this force cannot be overstated. Ancient Gallic society was riven by tribal rivalries that had persisted for generations. The fact that so many tribes could unite, pool their warriors, and march as a coordinated force demonstrated both Vercingetorix's political genius and the existential threat the Gauls perceived in Roman conquest. By late September, this massive host approached Alesia. When their scouts brought word of the Roman fortifications, the Gallic commanders were stunned. Caesar had not merely surrounded Alesia with a siege line, he had created a fortified zone so extensive that it seemed to transform the entire valley into a single vast battlefield. Still, the sheer numbers of the relief force gave the Gallic commanders confidence. Surely these walls could not stand against such overwhelming force. The relief army established its camp approximately 3 kilometers from the outer Roman fortifications. On the hilltop, Vercingetorix's warriors could see the campfires of their rescuers spreading across the landscape. After weeks of starvation and despair, hope returned. The defenders prepared themselves for battle, gathering what remaining strength they had for a coordinated breakout attempt. What followed was 3 days of some of the most intense combat of the ancient world, a battle that would be fought simultaneously on multiple fronts as Roman legionaries struggled to hold their positions against attacks from both inside and outside the fortifications. The first day opened with a massive cavalry engagement on the plain west of Alesia, in an area now called Les Lomes. Gallic horsemen attempted to test the Roman defences, probing for weak points while engaging Caesar's Germanic auxiliary cavalry in a swirling melee that lasted from noon until sunset. The fighting was inconclusive, with neither side achieving a decisive advantage, but it revealed something crucial to the Gallic commanders. There was a gap in the northwestern sector of the fortifications where difficult terrain had prevented the Romans from completing continuous walls. The second day saw the relief army launch coordinated assaults against the outer fortifications while Vercingetorix's forces inside Alesia simultaneously attacked the inner walls. The concept was sound: force the Romans to split their attention and resources between 2 threats, preventing them from concentrating their forces at any single point. Caesar's legionaries found themselves in the nightmare scenario their commander had risked, fighting on 2 fronts simultaneously, with Gallic warriors attacking from opposite directions. The fighting was ferocious. Gallic warriors filled in the outer trenches with fascines and earth, trying to create causeways across which they could charge. They navigated the deadly trap fields, losing men to the concealed stakes and pits, but pressing forward with desperate courage. Roman artillery engines called ballistae and onagers stationed in the towers launched heavy bolts and stones into the attacking masses. Legionaries on the walls threw their pillar into the packed Gallic formations and then drew their gladii for close combat as warriors reached the palisades. At several points, Gallic attackers managed to reach the top of the fortifications, and brutal hand-to-hand fighting erupted on the ramparts. But Roman training and discipline held. When one section was hard-pressed, cohorts in reserve rushed to reinforce it. The system of fortifications, for all its gaps and imperfections, was doing what Caesar had designed it to do, channeling attackers into kill zones where superior Roman organization and equipment could overcome superior Gallic numbers. But Caesar's response demonstrated why he was considered one of history's great generals. He committed Mark Antony with additional cohorts to the threatened western sector. The young officer, who would later become famous in his own right, led a furious defense that pushed the Gauls back from the walls, buying critical time. Meanwhile, other Roman reserves rushed to reinforce positions where Vercingetorix's forces had nearly broken through the inner fortifications. By nightfall on the second day, both Gallic assaults had been repulsed, but at significant cost to both sides. The walls were holding, but the Romans had suffered casualties they could ill afford. More critically, the attacks had revealed the weakness in the northwestern sector. The Gallic commanders now knew exactly where to concentrate their next assault. The third day, September 2nd, by modern calendar reckoning, would decide everything. Gallic scouts had thoroughly studied the incomplete fortifications in the northwest, where a steep hill called Mount Rhea had prevented the Romans from building continuous walls. The relief army assembled a strike force of 60,000 warriors under Vercassivellaunus's personal command. This force would assault the gap, while the rest of the relief army and Vercingetorix's forces inside Alesia launched diversionary attacks along the entire perimeter of fortifications. The assault began before dawn. Under cover of darkness, Vercassivellaunus led his 60,000 warriors on a flanking march around the outer fortifications. They approached Mount Rhea from an unexpected direction, and when dawn broke, they launched their attack on the undermanned Roman positions in the northwest. Simultaneously, the main relief army assaulted the outer fortifications on the western plain, and Vercingetorix's forces inside Alesia attacked the inner walls with everything they had left. For the first time, Caesar's system appeared to be failing. The Romans in the northwestern sector were desperately outnumbered and facing an enemy that had identified their weakness and was exploiting it mercilessly. The Gallic warriors navigated the trap fields, accepting horrific casualties but maintaining their momentum. They reached the wooden palisades and began tearing them down, creating breaches through which thousands more warriors could pour. Caesar dispatched his capable subordinate Labienus with 39 cohorts, nearly 15,000 men, to the threatened sector. Labienus arrived to find the situation worse than reported. The Gauls had broken through the outer fortifications in several places and were pushing deeper into the Roman defensive zone. Roman legionaries were fighting and dying in desperate close-quarters combat, trying to hold positions that were being overrun by sheer weight of numbers. The entire western sector was also under extreme pressure. Vercingetorix had led his starving warriors down from Alesia in a final, desperate attempt to break through. These men knew this was their last chance. If they failed, starvation would force surrender within days. They fought with the courage of the doomed, throwing themselves at Roman defenses with utter disregard for their own lives. At this critical moment, Caesar made a decision that would become legendary. Recognizing that the northwestern sector was the key to the entire battle, he personally took command of the final reserves. A force of cavalry and elite cohorts held back for exactly this kind of emergency. Caesar mounted his horse and rode toward the collapsing northwestern defenses, deliberately wearing his distinctive scarlet commander's cloak so his soldiers would know he was coming. Ancient sources, particularly Caesar's own account, emphasized the psychological impact of his arrival. Exhausted legionaries who had been on the verge of breaking suddenly found new energy. The sight of their general riding into the most dangerous part of the battlefield, risking his own life alongside theirs, provided a morale boost that mere reinforcements could not have achieved. Whether this is historical fact or propaganda embellishment is debated by historians, but the Roman lines did stabilize. Caesar's relief force struck the Gauls from an unexpected direction. While Labienus held the fortifications and prevented further breakthroughs, Caesar led his cavalry in a sweeping flanking maneuver around the outside of the collapsing Roman lines. This force appeared suddenly on the rear and flank of Vercassivellaunus's 60,000 warriors, who had been focused entirely on the breach they were exploiting. The psychological shock was devastating. Gallic warriors who thought they were on the verge of victory suddenly found themselves attacked from behind by fresh Roman cavalry. Confusion spread through their ranks. Were there more Romans than they had thought? Had reinforcements arrived? The carefully coordinated assault began to fragment as units turned to face this new threat. Seizing the moment, Labienus ordered a counterattack. The Roman legionaries who had been desperately defending the breaches now advanced. pushing back against warriors who were looking over their shoulders at the cavalry assault developing in their rear. The Gallic assault, which moments before had seemed on the verge of success, collapsed into chaos. Vercassivellaunus's force began to retreat, first in good order, but then with increasing panic as Roman cavalry pursued them. The withdrawal quickly became a rout. Warriors fled across the same ground they had advanced over at dawn, but now they were pursued by disciplined cavalry who cut down thousands as they ran. The disciplined slaughter was merciless. The plain northwest of Alesia became a killing ground where desperate Gauls were hunted down and butchered. Meanwhile, on the western plain, the main Gallic relief army had been watching their elite strike forces assault. When they saw Vercassivellaunus's warriors fleeing with Roman cavalry in pursuit, morale collapsed. The realization spread that the assault had failed, that there would be no breakthrough, that thousands had died for nothing. The relief army began to melt away, first in ordered withdrawals, but then in panicked flight as units dissolved and warriors fled back toward their tribal lands. Inside Alesia, Vercingetorix and his warriors had been fighting their own desperate battle against the inner fortifications. They had broken through in several places and had been on the verge of linking up with the relief force when they saw what was happening on the plain. The sight of their rescuers fleeing, pursued by Roman cavalry, was crushing. Slowly, the warriors inside Alesia pulled back from the Roman lines and retreated to the hilltop fortress. The Battle of Alesia was over. In a single day of fighting, the largest Gallic army ever assembled had been shattered and scattered. Caesar claimed that had his soldiers not been utterly exhausted by a full day of intense combat and constant reinforcement of threatened positions, the entire relief army could have been annihilated. As it was, the casualties were staggering. Modern historians estimate that between 10,000 and 30,000 Gauls died in the final day of fighting, with many more wounded or captured as they fled. The following day brought an eerie quiet to the valley. The relief army had vanished, leaving behind their camps and equipment. Inside Alesia, Vercingetorix convened a council of the remaining Gallic leaders. The situation was hopeless. No relief force was coming, food supplies were essentially exhausted, and another assault on the Roman fortifications would be suicide. The young king made a final speech to his warriors, suggesting that they should decide whether to kill him or surrender him alive to the Romans. The decision was surrender. On September the 3rd, 52 BCE, Caesar ordered the Gauls to lay down their weapons and deliver their chieftains to him. The surrender was conducted with formal ceremony. The tribal leaders came out of Alesia and presented themselves to Caesar. Then came Vercingetorix. The accounts of the surrender differ dramatically depending on who's telling the story. The Greek historian Plutarch, writing years later, claimed that Vercingetorix staged a dramatic spectacle. According to this account, the young king donned his finest armor and rode out of Alesia on a beautifully adorned horse. He circled Caesar's camp in full view of both armies, then dismounted directly in front of the Roman general, stripped off his armor, and sat down at Caesar's feet, where he remained motionless until Roman guards led him away. Caesar's own account in his commentaries on the Gallic War is far more modest and probably more accurate. He simply states that the chieftains were brought before him and Vercingetorix was surrendered. There's no mention of theatrical gestures or dramatic speeches. For Caesar, Vercingetorix was simply another defeated enemy leader to be dealt with according to Roman custom. What happened next revealed the calculating political mind behind Caesar's military genius. The captive Gauls were divided up as spoils of war. Most were distributed among Caesar's soldiers, who could sell them as slaves, a form of battlefield bonus that helped maintain army morale and loyalty. But Caesar specifically exempted two tribal groups from this fate, the Aedui and the Arverni. These were the most powerful Gallic tribes, and Caesar hoped to win them over as Roman allies. By showing them mercy and returning their warriors, he sought to transform former enemies into supporters. This political calculation largely worked. The Aedui and Arverni would become important Roman allies in the years to come. But for most of the defeated Gauls, the fate was grim. Approximately 70,000 warriors and civilians were sold into slavery, scattered across the Roman world to work in mines, fields, and households, separated forever from their homeland and families. As for Vercingetorix himself, he was taken to Rome in chains. The young king who had nearly driven Caesar from Gaul was imprisoned in the Tullianum, the notorious underground prison in Rome where enemies of the state awaited their fate. The cell was a dark, damp chamber carved from stone, accessible only through a hole in the ceiling. Here, Vercingetorix would spend the next 6 years in darkness and isolation. Caesar couldn't immediately hold his triumph, the ceremonial parade celebrating his victory, because the political situation in Rome was becoming dangerously unstable. His enemies in the Senate were maneuvering against him, and the conquest of Gaul, rather than being celebrated, was being used as evidence of his dangerous ambition. The delay in celebrating his triumph meant Vercingetorix's imprisonment stretched from months into years. Finally, in 46 BCE, Caesar returned to Rome after winning the civil war that had erupted and held not one but 4 triumphs, celebrating his various victories. For Vercingetorix, this meant one final day in the light. The proud Gallic king was brought out of his dungeon, paraded through the streets of Rome in chains as Romans jeered and celebrated. He was displayed as the ultimate symbol of Caesar's conquest, the barbarian chieftain who had dared challenge Rome and failed. After the triumph ended, Vercingetorix was taken back to the Tullianum. There, in that dark underground cell, he was executed by ritual strangulation, the traditional fate of defeated enemy leaders in Roman triumphs. The young king who had united Gaul, who had defeated Caesar at Gergovia, who had inspired the largest coalition of Celtic tribes in history, died alone in the darkness, 6 years after his surrender at Alesia. The execution of Vercingetorix marked the symbolic end of Gallic independence, but the actual process of Roman conquest and pacification continued for years. Caesar's legions remained active in Gaul through 50 BCE, conducting what military historians call mopping up operations, suppressing scattered resistance and imposing Roman authority. The southwest of Gaul hadn't yet been fully pacified when the Roman Civil War began, pulling Caesar's attention and legions away from Gaul. Gaul wouldn't formally become Roman provinces until the reign of Augustus in 27 BCE, 75 years after the Battle of Alesia. Even then, resistance continued sporadically, with the last significant uprising occurring as late as 70 CE. But Alesia had broken something fundamental, the belief that Gallic tribes could successfully resist Roman power through united action. After Vercingetorix, no Gallic leader would come close to achieving what he had accomplished. The reasons for Rome's victory at Alesia illuminate why the legions succeeded in conquering vast territories, while Celtic warrior societies, for all their individual courage and tactical skill, were ultimately subdued. The battle demonstrated the superiority of systematic military organization over warrior culture. The Celts brought to Alesia everything that made them formidable: superior cavalry, fierce individual courage, enormous numerical superiority, intimate knowledge of the terrain, and the unprecedented political achievement of tribal unity. They fought with desperation and skill. Yet they lost decisively. Why? First, Roman engineering and logistics proved decisive. The double ring of fortifications at Alesia represented capabilities that Celtic societies simply did not possess. Building those fortifications required not just thousands of laborers, but standardized techniques, coordinated effort, and sophisticated planning. Every Roman soldier had been trained in military engineering. They carried tools for entrenching camps and building fortifications. They followed standard designs that allowed them to work efficiently without constant supervision. This created a military force that could reshape the battlefield itself through engineering. Second, Roman tactical flexibility exceeded Gallic capabilities. When the Gallic relief force identified the weak point in the northwestern fortifications and concentrated their strength there, they demonstrated good tactical thinking. But the Romans responded with a level of coordination that the Gauls couldn't match. Caesar could shift reserves from one sector to another, coordinate cavalry maneuvers with infantry defenses, and maintain communication across his entire force, even in the chaos of multi-front combat. This required staff work, messenger systems, and subordinate commanders who understood both their specific assignments and the overall battle plan. Third, Roman discipline proved superior to Celtic courage. This isn't to say the Gauls lacked bravery. The warriors who threw themselves at Roman fortifications, knowing they were likely to die, displayed extraordinary courage. But courage alone, however fierce, cannot overcome systematic tactical advantage. When Gallic assaults were repulsed, units became disorganized and had difficulty reforming for renewed attacks. When Roman positions were threatened, reserves arrived quickly and slotted into defensive positions with minimal confusion. This difference between individual heroism and collective discipline determined the outcome. Fourth, Roman sustainability outlasted Gallic desperation. The Gauls inside Alesia were starving, weakened by weeks of inadequate rations. The relief army was operating far from its supply bases, living off what they could carry or forage. The Romans, by contrast, had established supply lines and maintained field kitchens even during the height of the siege. Better fed, better rested soldiers fight more effectively, and this mundane logistical advantage compounded over time. Finally, Roman command and control exceeded Gallic coordination. The relief army was commanded by 4 chiefs, representing different tribal coalitions, a political necessity that created tactical complications. Coordinating multi-front assaults with forces inside and outside the fortifications required precise timing and clear communication. The Gauls achieved this reasonably well, demonstrating that Vercingetorix's political achievement extended to military coordination. But Caesar's unified command structure allowed faster decision-making and more flexible responses to changing battlefield conditions. The legacy of Alesia extended far beyond the immediate military outcome. The battle demonstrated to the ancient world that Rome's military system was fundamentally superior to traditional warrior societies. Other peoples facing Roman conquest learned from Gallic failure. You couldn't defeat the legions by assembling large armies and attacking Roman positions. Some adopted guerrilla tactics, others sought diplomatic accommodation, but none again attempted the kind of massed conventional resistance that Vercingetorix had led. For Rome, Alesia validated the entire military system that had been refined over centuries. The legions weren't just troops. They were engineers, logisticians, and tacticians who could adapt to any challenge. This system would carry Roman power to the farthest corners of Europe and beyond. For Gaul, Alesia marked the beginning of Romanization, a process that would transform Celtic Gaul into Roman France. The children and grandchildren of the warriors who fought at Alesia would grow up speaking Latin, worshipping Roman gods, living in Roman-style cities, and identifying as Romans. Within 2 generations, the memory of independent Gaul would begin fading, preserved mainly in the accounts of Romans like Caesar who had conquered it. But Vercingetorix himself never truly disappeared from history. In the 19th century, as French nationalism surged, the Gallic king was rediscovered and reimagined as a symbol of French resistance against foreign domination. Napoleon III, who fancied himself a historian, commissioned archaeological excavations at Alesia and erected a massive statue of Vercingetorix on the supposed site of his last stand. The statue, designed by sculptor Aimé Millet and still standing today, bears an inscription that reads, "Gaul united, forming a single nation, animated by a common spirit, can defy the universe." This romantic reimagining of Vercingetorix as a proto-French national hero is historically dubious. The Gauls were not French, and Vercingetorix's kingdom bore little resemblance to modern France. But the appeal of his story transcends historical accuracy. Here was a young leader who united fractious tribes, who defeated Rome's greatest general in open battle, who implemented sophisticated military strategy, and who ultimately chose to sacrifice himself rather than watch his warriors die in hopeless resistance. For modern military historians, Alesia stands as a masterpiece of siege warfare and engineering. The dual fortifications remain studied in military academies as an example of audacious tactical planning and brilliant execution. Caesar's achievement at Alesia, besieging a fortress while simultaneously defending against a relief army many times his size, has rarely been equaled in military history. The battle also illustrates a broader truth about warfare and civilization. Individual courage, warrior skill, and fierce independence are powerful forces, but they cannot overcome systematic organization, logistical superiority, and coordinated tactical execution. The Gauls at Alesia demonstrated that a warrior culture could achieve remarkable feats of political unity and military coordination, but they also demonstrated the limitations of warrior societies when facing professional armies backed by sophisticated military systems. In the end, the laughter of barbarian warriors who had mocked Roman tactics gave way to screams, then silence. The 80,000 warriors who had taken refuge in Alesia, believing their numbers and courage would prevail, learned the brutal lesson that would be repeated across Europe for centuries. Rome's legions didn't win through superior individual warriors, but through superior military systems that turned average soldiers into an unstoppable force. The wooden fortifications that Caesar built at Alesia rotted away within years of the battle, but their impact shaped the next 5 centuries of European history. The valley returned to farmland, the memories faded, and eventually even the location of the battle was forgotten. But the precedent it set, that systematic military organization would triumph over warrior culture, that engineering could determine battles as surely as courage, that logistics mattered more than heroism, echoed through the centuries, influencing how warfare would be conducted long after Rome itself had fallen. Today, visitors to Alesia Saint-Reine can walk the ridges where Roman towers stood, see reconstructions of the fortifications, and contemplate what happened in that valley 2,000 years ago. They'll find Vercingetorix's statue, standing tall and proud, gazing out over the battlefield where his dream of Gallic independence died. The inscription on the base captures both the achievement and the tragedy. Gaul united could have defied the universe, but unity came too late, and even united Gaul could not overcome the systematic military superiority that Rome had spent centuries perfecting.